Okay, we've covered a lot of ground so far. We've talked about HTML and how HTML generates a tree-like structure in the way that there are tags, and those tags are well-formed and nested. We've talked about the way CSS can be used both in an internal style sheet but also in an external style sheet in order to apply a presentation to that HTML document. We've talked a little bit about the concept of contextual responsiveness. We've thought about it in terms of ubiquitous computing, but we've also looked at it very specifically in the sense of a responsive web design, a web design that responds to different sizes and orientations of devices. We've introduced the idea of Bootstrap as a framework that can be used to achieve responsive designs. And so in this lecture, what I would like to do is give an introduction to Bootstrap so that you can see how the different classes that Bootstrap defines can be leveraged in your designs to create responsive websites. So that's what this lecture is, an intro to Bootstrap. I'm Professor Don Patterson. So at a high level, Bootstrap is a framework for achieving responsive designs, and it's helpful because it enables you to do it very rapidly, as long as you understand the conventions of what the different classes mean within Bootstrap. We talked about how Bootstrap is based on a grid metaphor, a grid in which we have multiple rows and columns within each of those rows. The basic layout mechanism for a Bootstrap website is the container. The container is a class that's applied to a div tag, and you can either have a container which has a fixed width, or you can have a container that has a fluid width. The difference between the two refers to how it adapts to different size web devices. A fixed width container is going to change its size as the size of the browser window crosses certain thresholds. And when those thresholds are crossed, the size of the rendering of those columns is going to jump to a next smaller size until the browser gets too small to render it, and then it will jump smaller. A fluid container, as a website size is changed, is going to expand to fill all the space that is available, and will smoothly reduce or grow size. Two different ways of possibly rendering a website. All right, so we're going to start by looking at what that entails. So a container is our basic mechanism. You can see that this blue, purple, and yellow layout taken from the Bootstrap website shows a kind of abstract layout of a website or magazine copy. The top one refers to the fixed width layout. Because the browser window is larger than what's necessary in order to render the content, and the content hasn't filled up the entire viewport. Instead, it's taken a size that's sort of a step. It's as big as it can render for that size. The next size would be too big to render in the space available. In the bottom, however, the container is expanded to fill the entire space. The top one uses the div tag. The div tag is a division tag. It doesn't have any presentation that's associated with it. It's almost like just a node in the HTML tree that's available to contain other nodes or to reference in our CSS formatting. So in this case, what we do is we start at a high level by defining a div tag whose class is container. Container is a class that's defined in the Bootstrap external style sheet. So when we apply the container label, the container value to our attribute class, we're going to have our div be styled or have the functionality that's associated with the Bootstrap class. The top one has just container applied to it. The bottom one has the class container-fluid applied to it. Any content that you want in your website is placed between those two div tags. Bootstrap recognizes 5 different classes of devices based on the width that's available to display the content. There's extra small devices, medium devices, large devices, and extra large devices. An extra small device would be something like a phone in a portrait orientation. And that corresponds to a situation when the viewport has less than 576 pixels wide to display something. A small device might correspond to a landscape phone device. That would correspond to viewports that have between 576 and 767 pixels available. A medium device like a tablet has 768 to 991 pixels available. A large device has 992 to 1199 pixels. And then an extra large device is anything 1200 pixels or greater. Those two-letter acronyms EX, SM, MD, LG, and XL will be used later in some of the class names in order to identify breakpoints at which we would like our content to change its responsive behavior. Our outer level is our container, and then our container is going to contain rows, and our rows are going to contain columns. And depending on how we structure that, we're going to get different kinds of presentations. So in the first level here, we see one of three columns repeated 3 times. That represents a container with one row, and that row has 3 columns. There are 3 columns of equal size, and the content within that column is the text one of 3 columns. In the second case, we see that the viewport has shrunk a little bit, and as a result, the text has wrapped, but the columns are still equidistant. In the third case, the size of the screen has shrunk a little bit, and we've given instructions to the columns that when they get too small, rather than being rendered horizontally, we'd like the rendering to switch to being a stacked presentation in this case. So all 3 of those presentations are generated by the same HTML, and based on the classes that we've applied to the columns, we get different behavior based on the size of our viewpoint. So that's what we want to dig into a little bit now. So at our highest level within our content, we have a div that has the container attribute, our container class. A container must contain a row. A row contains columns, and then our content should only be placed within columns that have been placed within rows that have been placed within containers. A container can have multiple rows, and a row can have multiple columns, and a column can have lots of content, of course. So here's 2 examples of HTML that have been put within the boilerplate Bootstrap template that we looked at in the previous lecture. This replaces where Hello World was previously. In this document, I've also applied an internal style sheet in the head element of the HTML, as shown in the upper left. And that's just so that we can put a border around some of our divs so that we can see them as they change. In the example in the bottom left, we can see that we have a container that has one container that has one container that has 2 rows. The first row has 3 columns. We identify those 3 columns because there are divs that have the attribute class with a value of COL for column. Each of those we've placed the phrase West Coast and East Coast on the top one. Because our top row has 2 columns, they're going to be rendered as equal size columns because we put no other information about the class other than just saying it's a column. The second row on the east side has 3 columns with the content California, Texas, and Virginia. And in that case, we've also said they're just going to be of class COL for column, so they're going to be rendered equidistant. The difference between the HTML on the left and the HTML in the center is whether or not we've defined a container or a fluid container, as they differ by the value of the attribute for the outer div and the class attribute. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you how the behavior of those 2 settings changes as you change the size of the browser in which the content is being rendered. And on the next slide, I'm going to show 2 animations of what happens when you render these 2 presentations. On the top is the rendering as a container, not a container fluid. You'll see that each one of those columns is equidistant. We have 2 rows, West Coast and East Coast, equal sizes, California, Texas, Virginia, also equal sizes, but the top row has 2 columns and the second row has 3 columns. You can see that just at the initial presentation, the container doesn't fill up the entire width. That's by design. It only fills up certain pixel step sizes. In the bottom, no matter what the browser window is, we're going to see that the columns and the rows take up the full width of the device. In the top case, as we shrink the size of the browser slowly, you'll see that while they stay equidistant, the rows are going to jump between maximum widths as the browser gets down, until it gets down to a minimum size, at which case it'll use all available space until it smushes entirely. In the second case, although the code is very, very similar, we get a different effect depending on what you want. In this case, it's very smoothly going to change from always taking up 100% of the width, but representing the columns equally, whether we have 2 or whether we have 3, and with the content that's internal to them. All right, so that's a really basic use of Bootstrap in order to generate rows and columns of content that adjust to the different sizes of our websites. The grid system itself is based on 12 columns per row. In the previous example, we didn't specify how many columns we wanted our content to cover. We just said make it equidistant, whatever you do. In this case, we're going to specify specifically that we want our content to take up a certain number of columns. So in the left, we see a subset of all of the content that we're going to see in the next slide. We see one row, which we have specified has 3 columns. Each one of those columns is going to take up 4 of the 12 possible column slots that are available to us. And because this is based on a 12-column layout, within any given row, you should never have columns that lay out to more than a total of 12. So 3 times 4 is 12, and 2 times 6 is 12, and 1 times 12 is 12. So these are all examples of appropriate numbers of columns. You can see I've added a second class to my row, text-center. That's also provided by Bootstrap, and that's going to center my numbers in the center of my column. On the upper left, I just showed you my internal style sheet, because we're going to see that the different rows and columns are going to be rendered with different background colors and borders so that we can see what's happening as we change the size of our document. So let's animate this. Here's an example of the code that I showed on the previous web page. I've given background colors and borders to the different components, and you can see that I've specified the different column layouts. In the first row, I have one row with 12 different columns in it. Each one has a class of COL-1. In the second, I have COL-2 and COL-4, COL-3, first one's COL-1, the second one's COL-2, the third is COL-3, the fourth is COL-4, the fifth is COL-6, and the last one is COL-12. Sorry, I got a little confused between division and number of columns. As we change the size of our web browser, it's going to smoothly contract because this is a fluid container, making sure that each one of those components takes up the number of columns that I've requested. Now I could mix and match different column sizes within one row. I could have one bit of content take up 2 columns, and the remainder of the column take up 10 columns. I could have a 6 and 6 ones all in one row. It doesn't have to be equal sized, but it does have to add up to a total of 12 columns in each one of the rows. All right, that's great, but that doesn't really speak to the stacking behavior that I mentioned earlier. So now I'm going to re-render that previous web page that I just showed you, but instead of just saying column-1 or column-2 or column-3 or 4, or 6 or 12, I'm going to add the breakpoints into the column class definition. So in the left column, although it's small, each one of my columns in my row has been given the class col-ex-1. That says that I want this column to take up, the content in this column to take up 1 column on an extra small device. In the extra small case, that's going to make that column as small as possible. In the small case, the second column, col-sm-2, I'm saying that I would like that the content in this column takes up 2 columns until the screen size gets smaller than until the screen width gets smaller than a small device, at which point I want it to stack on top of each other rather than being rendered horizontally. So forth with the 3 and the 4 and the 6 and the 12. But as I change the breakpoint for each one of these different sets of columns, you'll see that the behavior switches from being laid out horizontally to being laid out vertically at larger and larger widths of my device. So as we look at this rendered, we can see what I had previously, and now what I've specified is different column breakpoint widths. As I shrink the browser in this case, we're going to see that the column-large-6, the second to the bottom row with yellow 6s in it, is going to stack when the browser gets the shrinks. That's going to be the first one that shrinks. And then as it gets smaller, the 4s are going to shrink, and then the 4s are going to stack, and then the 3s are going to stack, and then the 2s are going to stack. And the 1s are always going to stay as small as possible. So as we run this, we see that the behavior is responsive based on what kind of behavior we want. As we get smaller, we would prefer to render them vertically rather than rendering them horizontally. So this is just to show you how you can leverage those different classes in order to cause stacking behavior. Now again, the row doesn't have to contain everything that behaves exactly the same way. You could have some of the columns in your row stack on larger breakpoints than other columns. As long as your column widths all add up to 12, you can define different breaking behaviors in a variety of different ways. And it takes a little bit of experimentation to get the kind of effect and to understand the layouts the way you might like to have them. The other thing to know about Bootstrap is in addition to having these column and grid layouts, it also changes the default presentation. So for example, the headings are a different presentation than they are by default. You get a sans serif font, you get different sizes, it looks nice and modern and gets away from the Times New Roman font. The outlines, the UL tag and the LI tags, and the UL tags and the LI tags within them also have a different layout. Also gives it a clean, modern look. And finally, if you use any form elements, the form elements are also restyled to be consistent with the same aesthetic. So content is resized in Bootstrap in addition to having the grid layout. Bootstrap has a lot of different features, and there's just one more that I want to touch base on, and that's the ability to have responsive images. So in this case, what we're doing is we're giving an image tag in addition to the normal stuff like the source of the image and an alternative text description of the image for accessibility purposes. We're also giving it the class whose value is image-fluid. Bootstrap defines this class. And when we add this tag to our image, what that's going to tell Bootstrap is it's going to say, as our screen size changes, please change the size of our image so that it fits within the column. So now we're going to have columns that are changing sizes, and based on how much space is available to that column, Bootstrap will change the image to fit within that column. So we'll start with the same arrangement that we had before, but I'll add my mug shot to the last column in each of the different rows. And what you'll observe as I shrink the screen is that the size of the images changes. And in particular, if you look at the top row, you'll see that my image gets very small as the columns labeled with 2 become smaller and smaller. But as I hit the breakpoint, at which the row with the 2's in it is no longer laid out horizontally and becomes stacked layout, the picture will grow again to fill up the space that's available for that cell in the row. So here we go as we shrink it. You can see slowly as we shrink, the lower rows are going to stack earlier because they have a larger breakpoint, and the images on the upper right are going to shrink because there's not as much space available to them until the row stacks vertically, at which point the image expands again for the space available to it. Finally, the postage stamp size version of my head gets smaller until the row stacks, and then it goes back to its full size. So this is a nice feature that's available to us within Bootstrap as well. Resizable images, responsive images. There are lots of other helpful aspects of UI components that Bootstrap makes available to us. Nav bars and buttons and progress bars and so on and so forth. And if you couple these with the responsive layout, you can very quickly get a nice prototype of a website. So here's an example of the real basic prototype template that Bootstrap makes available that shows all the different features many of the different features that are available. So what you'll see here is that responsive column grid-based layout being used in a way that has some aesthetic sense to it. Again, I am not a graphic designer. And so you'll see the top row is one big row that doesn't stack, but the second row consists of those 3 headings and some text, and they will stack as it gets smaller. Now in this animation, I'm going to click on different components, and although the components provide visual feedback that something has been interacted with, there's no functionality that's been attached to it. That would require JavaScript, and we'll tackle that in a future lecture. But for now, you just see the visual appearance as you interact with the different components. So as you shrink the size of the window port, the columns contract as appropriate. You can use buttons and click on different components, click on the nav bar to get a drop-down list. All those things are just part of what Bootstrap provides with no functionality. And as you shrink the screen even smaller, you see that second row stacks on top of itself, and it becomes a very nice phone-based presentation of a website that would render well also on a desktop environment. And so this ability to render well, whether or not you're in a desktop environment or a mobile environment, is responsive design. Another thing that you can see happened was that the navbar menu, which was fully laid out in the desktop size window, collapsed into a hamburger menu when it became a phone-sized interface. I'm no fan of the hamburger menu, but it is an example of responsive design. So in summary, Bootstrap is a framework that enables you to very quickly prototype responsive web designs. In many cases, it's used not just for a prototype, but for a fully deployed website. And it's completely appropriate to do that if that's what you want. There are a lot of options for ways in which you can make it look more like an aesthetic that's unique to what you would like, as well as a lot of functionality for things that you can add in terms of styling windows and text, graphics, different kinds of menus that are available. It's worth looking over the website in order to see that. This is much faster than trying to style a responsive website by yourself from scratch. Something that seems like a complete waste of time, quite frankly, given that frameworks like Bootstrap are available that very skilled and experienced developers have been working on for a long time and have been evolving as web standards evolve. So thank you for your attention. That will give you enough knowledge to be dangerous with Bootstrap, and we'll continue looking at that as we move forward. Thank you.